Philosophy provides the tools, the terms, and the analytic means that enables us to pause and consider how we arrive at decisions, belief, and knowledge. Professor Griesmaier was born and raised in Vienna, Austria. After undergraduate study at the University of Vienna, he earned a master's degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then a PhD from the University of Arizona. He came to the University of Wyoming in 2000, where he's been teaching undergraduate and graduate students in philosophy ever since. Franz-Peter's area of expertise is in the study of explanation. He explores questions like, what makes a good explanation? What kind of explanations help us understand? And how can we know if an explanation is rationally sound? His 2015 book, Rationality and Epistemic Sophistication, branches out to the question of what it means to formulate a rational thought, and how can we tell a rational explanation from an irrational one. And that brings us to this morning's topic, UFOs, psychics, and other weird stuff. What to make of it rationally. Professor Griesmaier.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Thank you for coming this early on a Saturday morning. And despite the fact that it's not Sunday, I'm going to start with a confession. The title is a bit of a bait and switch. I'm not going to talk very much about UFOs and psychics. I'm going to talk more about evidence and rationality, but use examples stemming from people's views about UFO psychics, what else do we have? Iridology, palmistry, and those kinds of things, if you know what I'm talking about here. To talk about the relation between evidence and what kind of beliefs we should form on the basis of the evidence. And in the course of my discussion, I will introduce or remind some of you of certain facts about human perception and human reasoning, psychological facts, that can often be appealed to when it comes to explaining certain kinds of evidence we have. So let me start with an example. What do you see here? Not much, I know. So it's an airplane with some light in the back. Here's how the photographer enlarged it. And so now you say, what might that be? Okay, maybe. So what you're doing now, when you look at this thing, you have some visual evidence, and you're trying to figure out what is it? What does it show me? So you're trying to find out what explains the evidence that I have. Okay, so there's a couple of possibilities. When you ask yourself, what should I believe now? Some people are predisposed to say, well, look at that, there are some extraterrestrials that are visiting Earth. They're going to try to save us from ourselves or whatever, or try to enslave us. Who knows what they have in mind? Other possibilities, of course, are things like maybe it's a light reflection in a lens. That's a possibility. Okay. Another one would be maybe it's space debris. We know there's tons of material coming down from the orbit that we put up there almost on a daily basis. Okay. Or maybe it's just fake evidence. A guy just made it up, photoshopped it or something. Okay? So these are all possible alternative explanations for the same bit of evidence. The question is, how do you choose which explanation to accept, and therefore, how do you choose what should you believe on the basis of that evidence? Lesson 1, each piece of evidence is compatible with many different beliefs. Okay? We know this also, of course, from the context of the sciences. So look at this graph here for a moment. Okay? So suppose the little dots are your evidence for the relation between x and y, the dependent and independent variable. Okay? How many different ways are there in which you can connect the dots? Well, the straight line is one, but there are all these other curved lines. All these different lines correspond to different beliefs about what the functional relation is between the evidence, different beliefs what the functional relation is between x and y. So you have evidence, and you have indefinitely many different beliefs that are equally compatible with the evidence. That has a technical term. It's phenomenon. It's called the underdetermination of theory by data. Every set of data is compatible with indefinitely many theories. in this case, of course, infinitely many theories. There's infinitely many lines you can draw through those points. Okay? There's ways in statistics to deal with this problem to a certain extent. That has to do with choosing simpler theories over more complex ones in certain kinds of situations. But as an important first step towards evaluating evidence, you gotta be aware of the fact that the first thing that comes to mind is not the only thing that's possible. Okay, there's lots of other alternatives out there. Let me give you a more realistic example. You relax in your living room. Okay, well, apparently you're not there, but imagine yourself being there. And now, while you're sitting there, you're hearing something. So you're sitting there, what was that? What's going on up there? And so you say, have another sip of beer or whatever your beverage of choice is. And then it occurs to you. Clearly, gremlins from outer space have landed on my roof and they're now bowling in my attic. That's what happens. Okay? Clearly that would explain the sound. Notice, if this were true, the probability of hearing those sounds would be very high. Okay? So it's actually a possible explanation. Okay? We call it technically that this hypothesis of the gremlins bowling in the attic has a high likelihood. Not a high probability, but a high likelihood. Because if it were true, it's highly probable that you hear those sounds. Okay? But then you sober up and you say, maybe not. Maybe, what was this? A little kitty's running around in your attic and you have old beer cans stacked there and it's chasing a mouse and running through those. Okay? So maybe that's it. Okay? Another possible explanation. Actually, I like this one better than the gremlins. It's much cuter. So we have competing explanations again. Was it gremlins? Was it a cat or cats? Maybe the neighborhood kids, okay, playing a prank on you, and so on. So the question is, how do we figure out which one it is? And so what we try to find is the best explanation for the evidence. So we have a bunch of competing explanations, and then we engage in this particular kind of inference, which is called technically inference to the best explanation. Now you're going to ask yourself, okay, tell me more about this. In particular, tell me what makes one explanation better than another explanation. That's the tricky part here. Okay? Here are a couple of examples of criteria for best explanation that people have considered and proposed. One feature an explanation should have is that it's fairly conservative, in the sense that it doesn't require you to change a lot of the other beliefs that you have. Okay? So take the bowling or the noise example again. Okay? Of course, believing that a cat got into your attic and is running around chasing mice is much more conservative, because you don't have to change any beliefs about the world other than there's not a cat in my house, which there wasn't before. Okay? But if you accept the gremlin explanation, you would have to accept a lot of other things. Okay? You would have to revise your entire worldview, and that's costly, because you have to give up beliefs for which you used to have good evidence. And once you give up one belief and revise your belief system, you might have to revise other beliefs, and all of a sudden you're standing there, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Okay, so go with the conservative stuff. Another possible related criterion is to choose the explanation that's most plausible, given your background knowledge, which again would point to the cat in our case. Another one is go with the explanations that's the simplest one. Okay? Don't explain something in terms of very extravagant processes if simple processes will do. Okay? Or choose an explanation that has unifying power. What do I mean by unifying power? Well, you want to have an explanation that not only explains one particular fact in the world, but more than one fact. So think back to your favorite piece of Greek mythology. Okay? Lots of natural events were explained by postulating individual causes for those events. Zeus got mad at Hera and now he's throwing around lightning bolts and stuff like that. So you have all those different explanations and you never get a unified worldview out of it. So if you find an explanation that has the power to unify your worldview, everything else being equal, it's preferable. Okay. And there's other examples. We can talk more about this stuff in the Q&A if you want to. Now, as Paul actually pointed out in his introduction, very often we don't have to worry about finding the best explanation for our evidence, namely in ordinary situations. Suppose this is the situation in which you're in. Okay? Good viewing conditions. You see a whole bunch of trees in bloom, and what you're going to do is form automatically a belief. Okay? Look at those beautiful trees in bloom. You're not going to stop and think, oh, what is this? What could this be? Is it a holographic projection or something like that? Unless you're a philosopher. Okay, and I have to tell you the truth. We think about, am I a brain in a vat? Am I in the matrix? How can I know that I'm not in the matrix? And this thing is real, okay? Normally, in everyday life, even philosophers don't do that, okay? I'm not worried about you being not here right now. But we could play that game too. But normally most of our beliefs are formed automatically on the basis of evidence. Not under every condition. So look at this. We have bad viewing conditions. Now you've got to be a bit more cautious about what to believe, okay? It looks like there is one person there, possibly, maybe some other people in the background, maybe something else. So you're going to be not as certain of your beliefs as you were in the first situation, where you just see the blooming trees. Okay? So you form cautious beliefs. There are people, but how many exactly? Are there other things? Was there maybe Bigfoot in the background somewhere there? Okay. But so you're going to be a little more cautious. Okay. Lesson 2. How quickly I should believe something depends on how good my evidence is. Okay. In the first case, yeah, the evidence is good, the evidential situation is good, so I'm going to believe it, I don't worry about it. Okay. Or alternatively, how strongly I should believe something also depends on the quality of my evidence. I should not just believe something very strongly if the evidence is very weak. There has to be a kind of a proportionality in my beliefs relative to the evidence. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some other or an important psychological fact about perception, human perception, that results in the fact that sometimes even when the evidence looks good, we might not always be able to trust it. And something has to do with perceptual illusions. Let me give you a couple of examples. So some of you might have seen this. It's called the Hermann grid. What do you see when you look at it? Do you see anything in the white fields? Yeah. If you focus on this one, you might see gray dots around here. Okay? It's just how our visual information processing system works. It fills in this sort of information which is not really out there. Okay? There is no gray dots, which you can see by scanning from one intersection to the other. It's all white. Okay. Here's another example. I hope this works at the distance. What do you see? Is it moving for? Yeah. If you stare at it without eye movement, it's going to stop moving. But if you kind of scan it, it looks like the picture is moving. There's no movement in this. This is not an animated GIF or anything like that. Okay? So this is called movement illusion. We sometimes see motion when there is none because of how we interpret certain kinds of patterns. Here's a famous one, the so-called size illusion. Of course, the three figures are exactly the same size. It's just that the context makes the right one look much bigger than the left one. Okay? So think about reports of UFOs. Oh, it was it was very, very big. Well, let's wait a minute. Let's see what the actual visual evidential situation was to know whether that's the case. And often, some of you will have seen pictures of so-called UFOs. There's no background. There's nothing that you can use to disambiguate the size of the thing. Okay. So this leads us to lesson 3. Some perceived events can be explained by what's going on in our mind better than by what's going on in the world. Okay? And remember, we're looking for the best explanation. And sometimes the best explanation is we have been subject to visual perceptions. That's just how the mind is built, unfortunately. Okay, we are not surveillance cameras. Perception has constructive features. Okay, so here's another example, so-called color constancy. If you have an object with a particular color, it looks the same color to you no matter what the lighting conditions are within a certain range. Okay, of course, the reflected wavelengths are always the same. If there's bright light out there, you get different wavelengths reflected than in here, for example. It still looks like the same color. So we kind of fill that in. Okay, there's other examples illustrating this lesson, which are sort of fun. I'm going to talk about them for a little bit. Let me just check what time it is here. Yeah. Elizabeth Loftus at UC Irvine did some famous experiments on the role of expectations in perception. Here's one of them. So she was testing the reaction time of her subjects when they're exposed to a certain stimulus. So she gave them all a clicker and said, okay, hit the button, go down that hallway and hit the button as soon as you see the light come on, okay? And we're gonna test your reaction time. One after the other, they went down the hallway, clicking. There was never a light coming on. There was just no light. Everybody saw a light, okay? Expectations play a very strong role in what we see. Here's another example from John Doris down at Wash U, his so-called artifacts experiment. So what he had people do is he had them in front of a computer screen solving some cognitive puzzles, okay? And divided into 2 groups, treatment group, control group. And in the treatment group, people were primed with words flashed very quickly on the computer screen. In this case, it was inner city, hip-hop, rap, black, and so on. And after that, he gave them another task. The task was sort the following artifacts into tools and weapons. You can imagine what the outcome was. The treatment group, who was primed with words like hip-hop, rap, and so on, had many more weapons than the control group. Implicit cognitive bias that influences how we categorize certain kinds of evidence. Okay. There's another one I'm just going to throw in because it's fun. So a similar setup, but now the priming words were things like Florida, shuffleboard, bingo, spandex, early bird dinner. And the control didn't have that. And it turns out he measured the speed with which people left the room. The people who were primed with the Florida terms slowed down by 15%. They all were convinced now they're retired. Okay? So these are examples of how expectations and subliminal cues can influence not just how you interpret the evidence sometimes, but also what you seem to be seeing out there. Okay? Now, apart from us being subject to certain kinds of illusions, we also have to worry about cognitive biases. Here's just a couple of them. I'm going to talk about the so-called confirmation bias, which is the bias to look only, the tendency to look only for evidence that confirms what you already believe, and you don't even look at disconfirming evidence, at possible evidence that says that you are wrong. Okay? It's just in our nature to try to prove to ourselves that we are right. Okay? Another one is the so-called availability error and hasty generalization. They are often connected. And in this case, what happens is that we're only using psychologically salient evidence when trying to figure out what to believe. Okay? There's evidence out there that somehow doesn't interest us. We disregard it. Not because it's potentially disconfirming, but it's not salient, it's not interesting enough. so we don't look at that. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's an example of an availability error. I found out yesterday that I'm a psychic. How did I find that out? Well, you know, it was the weirdest thing. Just when I thought about you, you called me. I must be a psychic. Okay? Or if it's somebody you're interested in, we must have a special connection. Okay? That could be it too. So you think about how exciting it is that just when you think about a person, they call. Okay? Of course, what's the problem here? You forget about all those times when you thought about the same person and they didn't call. Okay? So that's the availability error. It's psychologically salient, and you remember it more for a longer time if it happens that when you think of somebody, they call you. And so you don't even think about the other times when they don't call you. Okay? But of course, if you take that into account, then you say, well, it's probably just a coincidence. Okay. Here's another example of the confirmation bias now. Astrology works. How do you know that? Well, I look at my birth chart and it is entirely accurate. Okay? Have you ever seen birth charts? This is basically something done by a professional astrologer. By the way, in the United States, there are 30,000 professional astrologers. There are 10,000 professional philosophers. Tells you something. What they do, you give them your date of birth, your location of birth, your time of birth, and they come up with a chart of your character traits and that sort of stuff. Okay? And you can actually do this, and then you get something. And people think, well, it's entirely accurate very often because they're formulated very vaguely. Okay? And you cherry pick the information that you think says something that's true about you. And you can actually play tricks on people with this sort of stuff. So there's the so-called foray effect. And I've done this a couple of times with an intro class, told them, look, I have friends down in Boulder. They are astrologers. Of course, they're in Boulder, the astrologers. They have crystals. They have all that stuff. And they're going to make a birth chart for you in exchange for you evaluating the accuracy of what they told you about you. Okay? And so I get the information from them, and 2 days later I give them back in a sealed envelope their individually made birth charts, or a week later, and then we're evaluating it on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being highly accurate. When I do this, I usually get, about 80% highly accurate and the rest accurate. Okay? And then I say, now exchange your birth chart with your neighbors. They're all the same. I wrote them. And it says, it's freshman class, it says things like, you're embarking on a new adventure. Duh. and stuff like that, okay? It turns out that if somebody asks you very specific information about you, you're much more likely to believe them what they tell you about you later. It's a very strong effect called the foray effect. That's what psychics use when they do cold readings. Okay, they get information from you and then give you something vague back and say, oh yeah, that's accurate. Okay, because of this strong effect. So we gotta watch out for these things in our belief formation. So the possibility of perceptual illusions and of cognitive biases are always available explanations. So if you have evidence, one thing you have to keep in mind, well, maybe some of it has to do, or maybe I didn't really see motion out there, or the size that I thought the object is not right because of size illusions, because there's motion illusions, and so forth. Okay. I saw something move really fast. Maybe. Maybe not. Or I experienced telepathy. Okay. I knew you were going to call me because I could feel it, and so on. Well, maybe not. Maybe that was just confirmation bias. Now, so how do we deal with extraordinary claims? And how should we infer anything about their possible correctness? Okay? The simple lesson here is extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. okay? It's a bad idea to think, okay, I have now I really strongly believe now in the presence of extraterrestrials because I've seen some vague pictures, okay? That's the wrong relation. If a claim is extraordinary, that means if it's in conflict with your ordinary views about the world, okay, or if it's in conflict, and that's also important, with what experts tell you about what's possible physically and so forth, then you gotta be extra vigilant when it comes to your evidence. You gotta have really convincing evidence in order to make an extraordinary claim stick. Not so much for ordinary claims. When you walk through the woods and you see a tree in front of you in broad daylight, yeah, you believe there's a tree in front of me. But if you walk through the woods and you see something that could be a Bigfoot or could be a tree trunk in the distance, it's not a good idea that you say, oh, look at that, there's Bigfoot. Okay, you need really strong evidence in those kinds of cases. Okay, so we need to use special care to rule out more conservative, simpler, or more probable explanations for the evidence. And the more extraordinary the claims are, the better our evidence has to be, the less ambiguous it needs to be. So, moreover, that conservative and so on explanations don't come to one's mind doesn't mean they don't exist. Okay, that's the other thing, of course, that sometimes explanations that are out there are not readily available to us. We haven't thought about this particular subject matter very often or in great depth, and so we don't think about these other possible explanations. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. Often we have to defer to experts, and that's basically the last section here. Defer to the experts. If your car makes funny noises, go to the mechanic first before you call those guys. Okay, that's it. Now you can ask me any question you want. Yes?
In the medical field, doctors often say if you hear hoofbeats, look for horses, not zebras. And I noticed that you had several analogies that are very similar to that phrase. Do you think that in our world, with all of the technology available to us, do you think that we are limited by that type of thinking, that you always need to look for the most logical? Do you think that's limiting?
No, I think it's liberating, actually. Why do I think it's liberating? First of all, I concede that it's fun to think about these weird things, okay? But once you notice that there are these more ordinary explanations for some of that stuff, that's exciting too. I mean, think about the perceptual illusions we are subject to, or our memory plays huge tricks on us. Okay, so we can't always rely on our memory either, unfortunately. Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of experiments on that. And on the other hand, once you look into contemporary physics, for example, the stuff that's going on there is so much more weird than extraterrestrials. Okay? Once you look at quantum mechanics and the possibility of backward causation, that is, I go like this right now, and yesterday somebody hears a clap here. Okay? I mean, it doesn't happen on the macro level, but because we know there are certain kinds of experiments done in quantum mechanics with particles, pairs of particles prepared in certain ways, and in quantum mechanics, whether something acts as a particle or as a wave depends on whether it's being observed or not. And you can have coordinated particles and shoot one off in one direction towards a screen and the other one in another direction. Whether this one that goes to the screen behaves like a particle or like a wave depends on whether the other one is going to be measured maybe 20 years from now. That's weird, okay? And so, but we still, in this case, want to make sure that we don't trick ourselves into believing there are crazy things out there while they're not, and rather find the ones that are really, truly mind-boggling. So in that sense, I think it's liberating, and also liberating in the old Enlightenment sense that you don't want to be, so to speak, almost frightened into believing all kinds of weird stuff that are out to get you, and so forth. Yes.
Do you talk about the Mandela effect in any of your classes?
Which one?
The Mandela effect? About, like, have you heard about this?
Remind me.
It's like a newer thing. It's like where you misremember facts, and it's named for Nelson Mandela because that's one of the best examples that people talk about. It's where they'll ask you, did Nelson Mandela just die or did he die?
Right.
And so, but people always misremember facts.
Yep.
So they're trying to determine why people are doing this. And it's not just that, it's a whole bunch of other examples if you look it up.
That's right.
About like why people are prone to just doing this.
Okay, he was asking about the so-called Mandela effect, which is the problem that some of us, or all of us, have sometimes in recalling certain kinds of facts or with misremembering facts. So there are, one of the explanations is often that we have problems, for example, with let me back up here. The memory consists at least of two parts. One is source memory, the other one is episodic memory. Source memory is the memory that tells you where you know something from, and episodic memory is the content of the memory. We all know that sometimes breaks down. You say, oh, I heard that Joe lost his job. I forget how I know that. That's a breakdown of source memory, okay? And Elizabeth Loftus, whom I mentioned earlier, did some other lots of research on memory breakdown. So here's another experiment she did. She gave a lecture like this and had her purse on the table. Often somebody runs in, screaming, grabbing the purse and runs out. Everybody's looking, whoa, what just happened? And she's terrified and so forth. An hour later, campus police shows up and asks the students or the audience for a description of the perpetrator. Well, between 5'2" and 6'2". Black, Hispanic, white, male, female, with hat, without hat. We are very often pretty bad, especially when it's a stressful situation. Our memory is not very reliable. And with source memory, that breaks down even more easily. There's a famous case told by Richard Schechter in his book, In Search of Memory, about a guy, a social worker, who had a client whom he visited twice or three times a week, and he came back, and the client was in an institutional setting, and he comes there one day, and everybody's laughing at his client and says, what is going on? Well, he's telling us that yesterday he was running around in a cape and chasing down villains in the village. He's an idiot. And what happened? The social worker, had taken out that client to see the newest Batman movie. Source memory breakdown. Okay? He had the episodes, but he didn't know, did I experience it, or did somebody else tell me about it? Okay, it really is very fragile with small kids. Okay, yes?
When you're bringing up Elizabeth Loftus, I recognize the name, and she's the one, like the predominant psychologist who talks about false memories, correct?
Yes, she's one of them.
Like people being convicted of a crime because of false accusation, things like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, she has done a lot of work on that, in particular with false memories about incest and rape in early childhood. She got death threats for her work because people did not like the possibility that some of these stories were just implanted. Partially it has to do with suggestive questioning by police, and they asked the same, tell us again how it happened, tell us again how it happened, and after 5 times, the 5-year-old thinks it happened, and that's a problem. Yes?
I'm thinking in terms, talking about how we look at evidence and, coming to sometimes the simpler answer to what it is, which, it's a UFO in the sky, right? Rather than it could be trash, or it could, maybe the lens has dirt on it or something like that. And I'm thinking, as a political historian, I'm thinking in terms of modern politics, which is kind of difficult to explain.
Granted.
Conspiracy theories that run rampant in our society today and cause fear and distraction from what's really going on. And I'm thinking in terms of the grassy knoll, the JFK assassination. It couldn't possibly have been this one fellow, this estranged, kind of small and meek guy who kills this wonderful, great giant of a figure in our history. Do you think that in some cases, Americans in particular, but I would guess it goes beyond the shores of America, are are choosing these easy ways out because they're too lazy to look at the other evidence? You think is there a tendency to say, I don't want to look at everything else because that makes it too difficult. I just want something real simple so I can move on and give you my 2-second or my, 20-second soundbite and let me go.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term lazy. I would maybe say busy, too busy for doing things sometimes the proper way. Because, as we know from science, coming up with a really well-founded scientific conclusion takes a lot of work. Takes field work, data analysis, all that sort of stuff. That's why we have specialists doing it. Takes a lot of training. Okay, that's why I said if sometimes people see or seem to have evidence for something extraordinary, and it's not in a field with which they're very familiar, defer to the experts. When I hear sounds in my car, I'm not going to go try to figure out what it is on my own. I'm going to go to the mechanic because those are the experts. If I feel weird physically, I'm going to go to the doctor. If I have problems with my mortgage, I think I go talk to a lawyer. I mean, we always do this, and that's the nice thing about our society. We have this division of cognitive labor, and we should trust that. That's very important, I think. That was, yeah, you were next.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, I think, does it not also have a little bit to do with comfort, the comfort of how we feel about things happening around us that are strange? If you take Dr. Niels' example of the grassy knoll, it is comforting for us to believe that John F. Kennedy's death was some, big conspiracy, rather than believing it was just some random guy with a personal vendetta. Just similar to your reference to the gods, Hera and Zeus, it is more comforting to believe that there are these beings up in heaven or wherever, whatever you believe in, having this fight or doing this thing, that they're causing it, and not just some unexplainable thing that we don't know why it's happening. So do you think that comfort plays a lot into how we interpret things that are strange?
Could be, and let me say a little bit about this, comfort and other emotions in general. So there is a interesting literature out there, the so-called belief revision literature, which comes out of computer science and involves some philosophy work. And they are worried about the following problem. So you have a set of beliefs, which is just a bunch of sentences, and you get now new information, you add a new sentence, and sometimes the new sentence conflicts with the old sentence. You have to revise it. How do you do this in the most conservative way? Okay, and often you're going to have a choice made, well, if I accept belief B, then I can kick out either A or C. Which one do I kick out? Both would give me consistency, but you don't want to kick them both out because you only need to kick one out. Which one should I go with? And in the literature, there's a term called entrenchment. The ones who are more entrenched should be the ones that are kept. Now, a former graduate student of mine worked on this problem and said, well, wait a minute. Entrenchment can be for theoretical reasons, but maybe also for emotional reasons. What sort of role do emotions such as comfort play in the entrenchment, and to what extent should we as rational beings take that into account? So in some cases, it's clear that you might want to discard certain kinds of evidence because it would make you crazy if it were true. So suppose you have a child and you hear some rumor your child there was an accident somewhere on I-80 between Laramie and Cheyenne and something's happened. Your child is up there. It's like, oh my God. No, I'm sure it didn't happen. Okay? That's rational because you don't want to get yourself into a panic. That would be a bad idea. I mean, for that claim, you need, again, very, very strong evidence in order to override the emotional attachment you have to the belief that your kid is safe. But that's work that's only people are starting to look into that because it's very difficult to come up with formal models for emotions, as you can imagine. There was a hand over there. Yeah.
I guess before you were talking about likelihood and probability. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is more likely, that the federal government and investigating agencies that looked into the existence of UFOs or political assassinations, that they actually know what happened and they're not telling the general public, or they have no idea what happened?
I don't have enough information about that. I mean, I can speculate. Depends on it's also going to depend on the particular case. Okay. So what I would try to take into account is what's at stake in that particular case. What's at stake if there are UFOs, for example, if they're extraterrestrial? What would be at stake? Okay. Why would it be important for the government to deny something like that? It doesn't look, unless you have extra assumptions about these extraterrestrials, for which you also need some evidence. What's at stake in covering up certain kind of clandestine operations? Well, there's probably more at stake, so there's a greater likelihood that that's covered up. That would be the place I'm looking, but I don't have any of the evidence for going either way in this case.
Okay, one more question. Earlier you were talking about what scientists tell us is how quantum physics work, the true nature of reality, the possibility of alternate universes and all that stuff. I mean, what do you think's harder to believe? That kind of stuff, or that there actually might be the existence of other life in the universe?
That's a good question. It depends, the answer depends on how you spell out harder to believe. On the one hand, the results of quantum mechanics might be hard to believe relative to a background of classical physics. Okay? If you're really immersed in that, then you go with Einstein and say, God doesn't play dice. Okay? This can't be right. There must be something we don't know yet about in order to explain all these kind of spooky connections. Okay? If you think, on the other hand, that given the vastness of the universe, it's probable that there's some other life form somewhere else. Okay? If that's what you mean by easy to believe, then that's easy to believe, but that's a far cry from saying, well, and they are intelligent and life forms. First of all, they are life forms we could recognize as life forms. It's unclear. There's a project at NASA about what is extraterrestrial life. What would it be like? What are the criteria for something being alive? It's not easy. So there's this whole extraterrestrial biology. Exobiology, that's what it's called. Thank you. And could they come here? Would they come here? Why would they come here? All that sort of stuff. Then you need, again, good evidence for those kinds of claims. So if you think that something is hard to believe, if you don't have compelling evidence for it, then I say, yeah, it is hard to believe that there are extraterrestrials visiting the Earth, and it's not hard to believe that these weird quantum mechanical phenomena occur because we have good lab evidence for that. Yes?
You think there's certain cultures around the world that have more propensity to believe in extraordinary claims?
Not a cultural anthropologist. I really don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there were cultural differences. If you have probably, when you think about the history of science, which is one of the things I do, yeah, I know, I think about that stuff. What you notice, of course, is that in cultures that are where literacy is less pervasive, you're going to have a greater tendency to believe things that are somewhat extraordinary, okay? Because people are not trained in certain kinds of ways and that and can't read and so on and have no formal schooling and so forth, and then you're often less careful with the evidence. But in general, you would have to ask a cultural anthropologist about this, sorry. Yes, Paul.
I noticed that your various lessons are all lessons about individuals.
Yeah.
Is there any thought, analysis, thinking about what happens when you put a group of people together and the group as a whole seems to believe something? And I mean, essentially I'm asking about herd mentality and
Right. Yeah, groups make a huge difference in what we believe and in how we act. So there's two ways in which this can work out. One is that we have a phenomenon of what you say herd mentality or collective cognition, which is what we're doing right now. We're trying to figure out, get clarity about certain kind of questions by asking each other and by giving comments and so forth. And often we achieve much more in that manner than each one of us could do individually, because we think of alternative possibilities that one of us or individual we might miss out on. Okay, that's why discussion is so important. The other question is, could people's beliefs and actions be influenced by being embedded in a group? Let me give you an example of how actions can be influenced. Again, John Doris did that experiment. So he had a person with an arm in a cast and a stack of books in her hands, walking down a sidewalk, and all of a sudden the books dropped, okay? And there were bystanders. Whether somebody would help the person or not depended in one setting on whether or not there was a lawnmower going in the yard next to the sidewalk. If the lawnmower was there, they wouldn't help because it's too much of a cognitive cost. It's annoying, okay? But the more interesting for our context is this, that if there was a group of bystanders, okay, and they did not know each other, then, let me get this right, then each individually was more likely to help. If it was their friends, then they were less likely to help. I don't know exactly why that is the case. But these things can be very influential. Also, of course, with respect to beliefs. I mean, you know, think about some of these religious sects, like the Kardashian, whatever they were called. You know, there was one in the 60s, and then was one in the 80s again, where somebody does some sort of is very charismatic and can convince people to believe certain kinds of things. And then if you have a critical mass, they all really believe it, become fervent followers, and they become blind to evidence in certain kinds of cases, to outside evidence. So yeah, that certainly plays a role there. Koresh, that's what it is. Thank you. Koreshians, David Koresh.
Oh,
Yeah, that one. Yes, Holly.
So FP, some people say there's an assault on science lately, and I know you're a philosopher of science.
Right.
And so a lot of things are interacting with online, fake news. What do you see as ways to mitigate that problem where people don't believe science anymore?
Do we have 2 days? I mean, the first thing we could try to do is make people aware of the danger to themselves by believing fake news and false and wrong sources of information. They wouldn't do it when it comes, think about it this way. Okay, now some people will hate me. But if I want to know something about, you know, I have a problem with my mortgage, okay? I'm going to really seek out experts. I'm not going to go to the local bar and say, hey, what are we going to do about this sort of stuff? Because too much is at stake, okay? And so the first thing we have to do is make people aware of the fact that a lot is at stake if we get certain kinds of things wrong, especially in public policy making, concerning climate policy or economics or our natural resources and that sort of stuff. That we need evidence-based decisions, that we cannot replace people's gut feelings for what's actually out there. And once you become aware of the dangers that are inherent in relying on bad sources, bad evidence, then you have to figure out, okay, how do I know what's a good source? Okay, there are rules of thumb. I mean, when you go to the internet, if it has an extension .edu, it's probably better than if it has an extension .com. The second one wants to make money. The first one wants to educate you, roughly speaking. Okay, there is this problem. I've actually been thinking about this lately. If a person starts off on the wrong foot, so to speak, is brought up with a mindset that certain kinds of evidence are the important kinds of evidence, maybe mystical insights, maybe tea leaf readings and so on. It's going to be very difficult to extract them from that, okay? What we can do is lots of public relations work, trying to show that in many cases, that's what I often do, in many cases, you yourself don't do that. If you want to know whether you have enough gas in your tank to cross the stretch of desert that comes up, you're not going to call your psychic. You're going to look at your gas gauge, okay, because that's good evidence. Or you're not going to do a tarot reading all of a sudden. So just reminding people that in many cases we do rely on good evidence, and then teach them about what evidence is. It has an indicator function, it's publicly available, it doesn't rely on any special cognitive powers and that sort of stuff. So that's basically what we're trying to do. Yes? Oh, sorry, there was somebody else hadn't asked yet.
So you mentioned 10,000 philosophers, 30,000 psychics. As an educator, I'm very concerned about who our philosophers are going to be in the future. And as a higher education administrator, I'm worried about the push away from thought and more to skill.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious in asking you as a philosopher, what are we going to do? Because we need thought.
I know. It's a hard sell. Because on the one hand, trying to think clearly through a certain problem can come across as a killjoy. I like believing this stuff, and are you telling me it's nonsense? No, I like it. It's fun, and so forth. So that's a hard sell, okay? Sometimes there's a lot of technical skills you actually have to master to do it the right way. Just like in the sciences, you have to do data analysis, data collection, all that stuff. In philosophy, you often have to do certain arcane forms of logic, going from basically normal kind of reasoning, formal reasoning, to things that are, I say, wow, really? That's what I have to learn now? But also bring across to our students, or get across to our students, the excitement that comes from thinking clearly through a problem, to not be afraid of saying, okay, I know if I go down this road with my thinking, I might not like the result, but let's go anyway. As we say here, let's cowboy up and do that. And think about these outside possibilities and not just stay where we are comfortable cognitively speaking. But you're right, it's difficult. And I'm sometimes pessimistic about the fact that the humanities in particular are often undercut a little bit and don't play a big role. And we have to fight against that. But also, what I do as a philosopher of science, of course, is I have the privilege to be able to bridge to the scientific disciplines. Okay, so I'm talking to computer scientists, I'm talking to physicists, I'm talking to people in psychology, and get their students to appreciate what we are doing, and then they go back there and say, oh, now I see what this problem in physics actually is from this more abstract vantage point. So that's the possibilities. Yeah. Yes?
I'd kind of like to tag on to that and just get your opinion. When the question is teaching people to think, in the culture there is this word elite, and people who have an education, a college education, are perceived as elite.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to be elite now.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of mitigating factors in the culture, plus the college education now is being priced out of a lot of people's reach, to make this the leisure time and to have access to the experts like you is rapidly becoming unaffordable for a lot of reasons for people.
Right.
So how do we it seems like we've got some cultural issues.
Yeah. I agree with you totally. To address the first point about the perceived elitism, it's right that there are elites, but it's also important to point out to people that in many cases they are seeking out elites. I want the best doctor to treat me. I want the best shortstop to be on my team. I want the best wide receiver. We like elites. And so we have to just, no, it's not a bad thing. What's bad is alleged elitism. When you have elites that are not really elites, they haven't done anything, the Kardashians and this kind of stuff. That's what we have to worry about. Okay, not the real elites. But you're right, there's this perception. And to your second point, that college becomes less and less affordable. Well, first of all, let's get them all into Wyoming. There we can afford it. And secondly, in Vienna, so now I'm talking a little bit about my roots, but way before I was born, in the 20s and 30s, there was a big movement emphasizing adult education. It was spearheaded by philosophers. Okay, so they were very interested in public lectures, in evening lecture courses for the general public, which was basically free for them to attend, in an effort to combat certain kinds of tendencies towards mysticism and political elite forming, the wrong kinds of elite sometimes. It died when the Nazis took over, okay? But it's still alive to a certain degree. They're trying to come in to bring it back. We have it here with land-grant universities. I mean, that's basically the mission of those universities, to get the highest standards of knowledge to the largest amount of people possible. And so we should try to keep it affordable, of course. I think there are some elite universities where you can now study for free. I think, who was it, Yale or Harvard? One of those two. Basically, if you get in, you don't have to pay, because they have such an endowment, they don't need the student tuition anymore, okay? And then we have to figure out, how to get politics aware, or to make them aware of the dangers that lie in a public that doesn't have the standard of education that is available, because they are finally going to make, or they participate in decision making that's going to affect us all. Yeah, you had your hand up for a while.
Yes, so right on the screen there, it says defer to experts.
Uh-huh.
And this sort of also piggybacks to the question about, how do we, keep our belief in science, with these things. What happens when our experts are people who don't have the credentials but have, become things like leaders of the country, even though maybe they don't have anything to back that up other than reality TV?
Right. So what you're asking is, how do I distinguish an expert from a fake expert?
Yes.
Basically, that's tricky. Okay, and it has become trickier, I think, with the increasing importance of the internet, because so much is out there, and for a layperson, it's often very difficult to distinguish between these things. And then also, the louder you talk, the more you believe. That's another problem we have, of course. We see that on several news shows and so forth. Try to expose them, the fake ones, like we did all during the history of science. I mean, think about back to ancient times, the Hippocratic Oath. What was the purpose of that? To get rid of the snake oil peddlers. That's really what it was all about, to professionalize certain kinds of disciplines. That's why we have universities and so on, because they are gatekeepers. Okay? And it would be nice if, for example, our political bodies included not just lawyers and business people, but also, and nothing against lawyers, but also scientists, humanities people, philosophers, what have you. Okay? How do we get there? Maybe the extraterrestrials are going to help us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.